Okay. I think we solved our technical problems. So that only leaves it for me to say hello and welcome to another fun edition of Adam's Music Box. It's the Saturday edition. As I was saying earlier, when we had a technical crisis, I don't really know how much of this stuff works. If it were up to me, it would be designed differently, but who cares? We're just here to have fun. And that's why I'm asking a kind of weird question, because weird questions can sometimes be fun. The question isn't what is progressive rock, which has been sort of discussed ad infinitum. The question is why is progressive rock? Now, well, what does that mean? Well, why is the terminology a thing? Why is there a certain genre of music which over time has become recognized by certain traits? Why is that term progressive applied to the rock? Is it rock at all? Why isn't the term progressive applied to other genres? And moreover, why, when it is, isn't the sticking point as sticky? So, in other words, why does the term progressive not stick to other genres when people have attempted to apply it to them when it has stuck on the rock label? And there's some interesting reasons for it. So, to understand that, we have to go back to a dichotomy that I discuss quite a lot on this channel, and that is, when did pop music become a thing? Because you could be forgiven for thinking, well, pop music just means popular. Everything is popular sometimes. Everybody loves somebody sometimes. Everybody and everything is popular sometimes. But that's not really what pop music means. It's partly what it means, but it actually means historically something different. Pop music emerged in the 19th century as something that differentiated itself through circumstance and through financial and business realities from something called folk music, the folk traditions of countries. Because prior to pop music, music could generally be segregated into two, maybe three different styles. On the one hand, there was the music of the populace. So you see where we're getting into pop music, but it was generally referred to as the music of the people, the folk, the folks. Call it what you will. Various languages. Folk is literally what it's called in German. Folkish, folkish. You sort of focus. Now that's a Dutch prog rock band. We'll get to them in a minute. But you see what we're getting at. And what was folk music? Well, folk music was music that was generally, and of course these are generalizations, but 99% of the time they're true in this case, it was performed by people who were amateurs. They weren't paid to make the music, maybe in a bit of beer every once in a while, but it wasn't their vocation or profession. They generally were not musically literate, and if they were, they certainly weren't fully musically literate. They were doing it for fun. They were doing it to entertain themselves and to entertain their friends and friendly strangers. That's the essence of folk music, and you can still sort of see it today. If there's, a backyard barbecue and someone breaks out a guitar who might not, be Segovia, but who can strum along, and other people start singing along, that is a folkish tradition. They might not be playing music of the folk, they might be playing music written by professional musicians, but the act itself is nevertheless part of the folkish tradition. And so long as there are guitars to play and songs to be sung and pianos to be found, elements of the folkish tradition will live on until we're all forced to live in pods, own nothing, and have a computer chip wired into our brain to vote for us. That will happen in approximately 18 months, I'm told. But there you go. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, in the pre pop era, there was what at the time was called art music, or later called classical music. Now, this was the music of the professional. This was the music of the highly musically literate and trained, and there were certain musical conventions that dominated Europe, because that's where in Europe and European derived societies we talk about art and classical music in this sense. There were certain traditions from around the Renaissance period up till the 18th, early 19th century. Italian style was the in vogue style. By the late 19th, pardon me, by the late 18th, early 19th century, the Germanic style had come to dominate this art music world in Europe. But obviously, every country had their own unique art music or classical music style. There was Berlioz and many others in France, Wagner and many others in Germany. Later on, Elgar and many others in England, Grieg and some others, let's say in Norway, in the 19th century Russia, not necessarily a European country, depends who you ask, but they had a pseudo European style classical tradition that was founded in the 19th century by the great Mikhail Glinka. And you see what we're getting at. There's the classical world where people are professional, musically literate, and then there's the folk world, which is do it yourself for yourself and your friends. And when I say musically literate, that actually means something very specific too. It means that you can read music, and in the case of being a professional composer, you can also write music. Think of it like literacy in the literal sense. If you are literate in a language, it means that you can read. And if you are an author, it means you have taken it a one step further. Not only can you read, but you can write original content as opposed to just writing out, dear sir, where is your folk music section? Email sent. I did say that you could look at it as a tripartite as opposed to binary system, and the third would be liturgical music. The reason that that could be a third or rolled into art music is that European classical music, as we have come to know it, came out of liturgical music traditions. So musicians that were composers for various churches, once they started composing secular music, that is what became classical music. Think of Bach. He was a liturgical composer for his local Lutheran church, but his music is also played in secular settings. And while he wrote great oratorios and hymns and other great liturgical pieces, he also wrote music that was designed to be played outside of a strict liturgical environment. Okay, so when does pop music come about? Well, pop music happens when the folkish traditions become a business. And when they become a business, it generally means several things. It means that what was once done for fun becomes professionalized at various levels. For some, it was a part time thing, for some, it was their entire life. So, but it essentially means music is being written. For profit. People want to make money from it. So instead of a guy who might be, a ditch digger who plays a guitar at the weekends, the pop music songwriter, because the songs, meaning music with words, is generally the typical style of pop music, as it is with folk music. It means that this is what they do for a living. And this happened first in the 19th century when sheet music, oh, sheet, it's a free show, you can't complain, became a huge business. Just as in the mid 20th century, recorded audio systems that delivered music became huge business, and it was relatively big even before the mid 20th century. In the mid 19th century, the sheet music boom was huge. It was good for the people who made pianos, who made organs, who made player pianos later on and player organs later on, other instruments too, because people who had homes and people who went to hotel lobbies and all these other areas, there would be musical instruments and there would be sheet music, and it was a form of entertainment. And the companies, the publishers that sold the sheet music, and the composers who wrote the songs and other musical compositions, they were the pioneers of pop. And as we get into the age in the late 19th century, early 20th century of better and better recorded audio and radio, then, the pop music world booms, and people in industrialized countries of the first world tended to forget about folkish traditions. Not that they ever went away, but they just became sort of they were supplanted by pop. So yeah, the guy sitting on the park bench eyeing little girls with bad intent. That's a Jethro Tull reference. The guy playing the guitar there, and he could be doing that as well, especially if it's on an island. Those people were still there. But people were less enamored of that than they were of, oh, look, it's the latest song by Irving Berlin. I'm going to buy the sheet music, and maybe I'm going to buy it on this Edison cylinder and listen to a professional musician sing Alexander's Ragtime Band, and all the rest of it. And so, what the hell is this stream even about? Oh yes, why they call why they call it progressive rock, but not progressive other things. So, pop music became a thing, and within the pop world, meaning the non-classical world, there were several other developments that happened. There was the music of the populace, the truly popular pop music, the songs that you could sing and know and love. Hello, my honey. Hello, my baby. Hello, my ragtime gal. But there were also other things that went on, like instrumental styles of ragtime, which, as the great music historian Foundering says, were not popular at the time. Things like The Entertainer by Scott Joplin, popular, yes, but much less compared to the songs that people could sing in this era. And then later on, things like jazz came about. And that's really where we take our first detour. Now, jazz came about as a popular style that owed a lot to the ragtime and the stride traditions of previous generations. It was generally music that was fun, it was danceable, people could tap their feet. But as jazz evolved, it became a musical style that although very different than European classical traditions, it became an increasingly demanding musical style that either required full musical literacy or a kind of rigor that was more familiar with the kind of practicing that musicians do in the classical world than the slightly less, or in some cases, a lot less practicing than they do in the pop world. Does this make jazz a progressive genre? Hmm. Well, it certainly did progress from its earliest, more danceable traditions, albeit played by good musicians, to by the time you get into the sort of late 40s, 50s, 60s, and beyond, it's a kind of genre that becomes synonymous with skill. So much so that by the 80s, you had to invent a new label called smooth jazz so that it distinguished jazz made for pop music listeners from the kind of hardcore jazz that was designed for people who really want to listen to music that entails complex compositions, very interesting, very interesting playing that required a lot of skill, very interesting improvisations, and so forth and so on. So, was jazz a progressive genre? You could say so for two reasons. One, because it literally progressed, it changed and got increasingly skill orientated from its inception to the middle of the 20th century. But you could also say that because by the time you get to, let's say, 1957, the kind of audiences that were listening to jazz were audiences that didn't want to hear regular music. And that gets us to Frank Zappa's definition of prog rock. And I go definitely check out this video on YouTube. Not now, wait till I'm done. I told you it's a free show, folks. So he was doing this interview, and the raw footage has been uploaded on YouTube and it's been circulating around for a long time. And the essence is that they say to Frank Zappa, "What is progressive rock?" He says, "All the stuff that doesn't sound like regular rock." I love it. No one shaved with Occam's razor better than Frank Zappa. So that's a pretty good definition. So, what is progressive jazz? Well, it's jazz that didn't sound like all of that other jazz. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, does Ornette Coleman and Pharoah Saunders and late John Coltrane sound like sort of Big Spiderbeck and Louis Armstrong? No, it sounds different, so you could call it progressive, but the name never really stuck. And that leads me to prog rock, because the name prog rock initially was slow to catch on. At first, it was just rock music, but that sounded different than other rock music. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that in the court of the Crimson King, or early Moody Blues, or early Yes, or Genesis, or ELP, didn't quite sound like the House of the Rising Sun, which was more R&B derived, even though the Animals later went very experimental themselves, as did a lot of people. And so prog rock was a term that later became attached to this rock that didn't sound like other rock. Interestingly, at one time they were calling it art rock, which was the term for classical music before the term classical music caught on. Very, very interesting, because while not all prog rock musicians are musically literate, most of them have to have the compositional performance and occasionally improvisational skills that would be needed in the classical environment. Improvisation in classical organ, lots of improvisation historically, and cadenzas that are now written began as improvisation in many cases. So there you go. There is improvisation in European classical music, even if they've tried to squeeze a lot out of it. And so this term prog rock stuck. And yes, subsequent to the term prog rock sticking, they've tried to apply it to things like progressive metal. That's kind of stuck. Progressive hip hop, that didn't really stick. They've tried to apply it here and there, but when you say progressive music or prog, because we all like abbreviations, not Prague as in Praha, the capital of Czechia, country in Central Europe, where they have lots of beer and Dvorak. But when you say Prague to someone in America or Canada or England or Australia, an English speaking country, even many non English speaking countries, we get what you mean. You generally mean progressive rock. And when you think of progressive rock, you think of ELP and Genesis and Rush and Jethro Tull and King Crimson. And I would say Kansas and Styx and maybe early Journey. You get the general idea. So the question now is almost as much of a matter of linguistics as it is about musicology in terms of why this label stuck. And several things come to mind. When rock and roll was invented, it was very much shunned by the mainstream pop world, and it was either ignored or occasionally detested by not all, but much of the classical world. Jazz had similar rebellious origins, but its conquest of the pop music world was quite rapid, and this was probably because you could trace its origins so specifically to the mainstream ragtime and stride music of earlier decades. Rock and roll, though, was something that was associated with rebellion. It was associated with a generation that grew up in a lap of luxury. Even though it has its origins in the poorer parts of the Black South with R&B and gospel music, as it came to be known, it became increasingly white and increasingly a suburban, increasingly a middle class genre. Now, again, not necessarily in terms of its roots, but in terms of certainly who was consuming it, and by the early 60s, increasingly and almost totally who was performing it. And so this made it something rebellious because if you're a normal white middle class guy from the suburbs, you should be normal. You should be listening to the normal pop music. You shouldn't be listening to this rebellious music, but listen to the rebellious music such a demographic cohort did. And so this sort of stained the middle period of rock and roll, let's say early 60s, in the sense that, well, if you were a good kid, you'd be listening to, a bit of Dean Martin and a bit of Frank Sinatra, a bit of Klaus. It's fun music and it can be scatological at times. It's got a bit of Klaus. Why are you listening to this stuff? And so it was tarred early on with the brush of sort of musical retardation, that this is music that the opposite, because retardation is going backwards, progressive is going forwards. And so it was tarred with that brush comparatively early on. And maybe that's the reason that the name prog stuck, because it was almost like you have something to prove. Like, this isn't like all that other rock and roll that you think of as regressive. This is progressive. This is going forward. And while the musicians themselves hardly ever come up with these labels, consumers, record store owners, PR men, Madison Avenue, the record labels themselves, they tend to use these things as a selling point. And for a while, before it became uncool and then cool again, because these things always go in circles, it was a term that was sort of used to say, hey, we're not the three chords and don't bore us, get to the chorus music. We have a 20-minute guitar solo and an organ solo, a bit like other progressive E genres, a bit like jazz. And we sound sometimes a bit like classical. And we sound a bit musicological. Say that three times fast after 10 whiskeys. But that's really why I think it's stuck, because it hasn't stuck to other genres that have a different reputation. Hip hop began as something that was poetic and informational and communicative and political. It was about young Black kids in urban areas, mainly New York at first, later other urban areas, communicating street poetry, the messages of the street. Poetry, obviously, before it was an art format, it was used to convey information, because before people were literate and before papyrus, before paper, the newspaper was the news, the information you needed to hear was transmitted orally. It's easier to remember something that rhymes and has meter than something that doesn't. So maybe that's why progressive hip hop isn't a thing. Progressive pop, well, people didn't really like that term, because the whole idea of pop, in terms of the populace, when we define it that way, which most people do, it's supposed to be something right in the middle. It's supposed to be something that the majority of the population can and does like, which means not too regressive, not too progressive. So that label didn't stick. Progressive country, well, country music itself, country and Western, is an outgrowth of folkish traditions. And by calling it progressive, it would sort of negate the fact that it was authentic. And yes, I know Dixie Dregs, I know there is progressive country, but as a term, it never really stuck. Again, for jazz, jazz sort of progressed by itself, didn't really require the label. And I'm trying to think of other genres. Progressive metal is kind of stuck, but hard rock, which became metal when it got a bit harder, and then adding prog to that, it isn't too. It's not so far away from the mainstream prog rock, if that's not an oxymoron of the 70s and 80s when it was at its most popular, arguably, as one might think. So that's in a roundabout way why I think linguistically this idea of progressive rock has stuck, while the word progressive, when applied to other genres, seems to just not have taken off in the consciousness and the vocabulary of the common man on the street. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments. Let me know if this is all nonsense. Let me know if you have an alternative theory, or let me know if you think that this is 100% accurate, because, music is all about the imperfections after all. So, as always, like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care. How do I turn this thing off now? Wait, I think I need to